I stood in my own living room while my husband stood in the doorway, packing a small weekend bag for our daughter. The air between us felt thin, heavy, and completely stripped of the quiet tolerance we had built our entire marriage on. For 12 years I had believed that if I just kept my head down, ignored his mother, and absorbed every passive-aggressive comment she threw at me, our life would stay peaceful. But after what happened 2 nights ago, the quiet was completely gone. The silence between us was not broken until my phone rang on the kitchen counter, cutting through the heavy air with a harsh, persistent chime. I picked it up and saw my father-in-law Arthur on the caller ID. I answered on speakerphone, stepping back so my husband Brian could hear every word. Arthur sounded older than his years, his voice raspy and drained from whatever war had been going on inside his own house since Christmas Eve. He did not bother with pleasantries, simply stating that he had just signed the final down payment gift documents for our new house, despite his wife threatening to leave him if he did. Arthur paused for a moment, letting the weight of his admission settle in the quiet kitchen before speaking again. He told us that he had spent 40 years believing that keeping the peace meant giving in to whatever his wife wanted, no matter how unreasonable or cruel she became. He realized now that the peace he thought he was buying was paid for entirely with my dignity. Hearing him say those words out loud made something shift inside me, because for the first time in over a decade, someone in that family had finally acknowledged the truth without trying to cover it up. When Brian ended the call, he looked at me with a mixture of relief and exhaustion, clearly believing that the signed paperwork meant our troubles were over. But I could not let him hide behind his father's sudden bravery. I looked him straight in the eyes and asked him why it took his mother physically putting her hands on me at the dinner table for him to finally step up. For 12 years, his advice to me had always been to ignore her, to let it slide, and to avoid making a scene. He sat down at the table, unable to look me in the face, admitting in a quiet, broken voice that he simply did not want to deal with her wrath himself. The next morning brought a fresh wave of tension as the loan officer called to tell us that underwriting was still processing the file. The delay meant our closing date was pushed back, leaving us hanging in a strange financial limbo while we waited for the bank to clear the paperwork. Brian tried to offer a weak smile, suggesting that a few extra days would give everyone a chance to calm down. I stared at him, realizing that even now, his first instinct was still to adjust our entire life around his mother's emotional tantrums rather than standing firm on what was right. By mid-afternoon, a knock at the door signaled the arrival of my sister-in-law, Heather. She stood on the porch wearing a heavy coat, looking far less confident than she had while throwing subtle insults across the dinner table 2 nights earlier. She stepped inside and apologized for not saying anything when her mother lashed out at me, admitting that the entire scene had terrified her. But as we spoke, the real source of her bitterness came to light. She had been counting on our father-in-law's money to solve her own messy divorce settlement, and she resented us for taking what she felt was her safety net. As Heather stood in my hallway, she accidentally let slip a detail that made my entire blood run cold. She mentioned an incident from 8 years ago when Brian had turned down a job offer from his uncle. For nearly a decade, his mother had publicly blamed me for holding Brian back, telling the entire extended family that I was controlling and isolated him from his relatives. Heather casually revealed that Brian had told her back then that he simply hated the job, but he had allowed his mother to go on believing that I was the villain behind his choice. When Heather left, I confronted Brian about the job offer, watching his face drain of color as he realized he had been caught in an 8-year-old lie of omission. He tried to defend himself by claiming he never explicitly blamed me, but he could not deny that he had stood by and watched his mother demonize me for years because it was easier than facing her disappointment himself. I realized in that moment that my mother-in-law was only half of the problem. The real heartbreak was discovering that my husband had used me as his human shield to protect his own comfort. I spent the remainder of the afternoon at my friend Susan's house, needing space to process the reality of my marriage away from Brian's desperate apologies. Susan handed me a cup of coffee and listened without judgment as I laid out the trail of subtle betrayals that had defined my life for the past decade. She reminded me that I did not need to make a permanent decision about my marriage by Tuesday, but that I needed to be completely clear about what I was willing to tolerate moving forward. Standing in her quiet kitchen, I knew I could never go back to being the silent scapegoat. When I returned home later that evening, I found Arthur sitting at our kitchen table alongside Brian, looking resolute. Arthur explained that he had called a family meeting at a neutral restaurant for the following afternoon, insisting that everyone who had been at that disaster of a dinner needed to sit down and face the truth. He told Brian that hiding from the conflict was no longer an option, and that if our family was ever going to function with any shred of respect, the lies and the denial had to end right there. The private dining room at the restaurant was suffocatingly quiet when Brian and I walked in the next day. Arthur, Heather, and my mother-in-law, Evelyn, were already seated, along with 2 extended relatives who had witnessed the incident on Christmas. Evelyn sat rigid in her chair, barely glancing at us before demanding to know why we had not brought our 3-year-old daughter along. I removed my coat calmly and told her that my daughter would not be part of this conversation, making it clear that the dynamic in this family was going to change immediately. Evelyn attempted to offer a rehearsed, lukewarm apology, stating that she was sorry things had gotten so emotional and out of hand during the holiday. I refused to let her hide behind vague language, directly addressing the fact that she had struck me 3 times in front of my child and called my daughter trash. Evelyn immediately flushed with anger, denying that she had ever directed such a word at my child. But Heather unexpectedly spoke up from across the table, confirming that she had heard every single word and watched her mother point directly at my daughter. Caught in her own lie and stripped of her usual allies, Evelyn turned her fury toward me, bringing up my humble background and claiming I had always carried a chip on my shoulder. She accused me of ruining Brian's life and keeping him from family business opportunities. But before I could even respond, Brian spoke up in a firm, grounded voice. He looked his mother in the eye and confessed to the entire table that every single decision she had blamed on me over the last decade had been entirely his own choice, admitting openly that he had been a coward for letting her hate me. Evelyn stared at her son as if he were a complete stranger, unable to process the fact that the control she had exerted over him for 30 years was crumbling right in front of everyone. She stood up, grabbed her purse, and demanded that Arthur leave with her immediately, expecting her husband to follow her like he always had. But Arthur remained seated, looking up at her with a quiet resolve, telling her that he was done enabling her behavior, and that the money and the decisions stood as they were. Evelyn walked out alone, the heavy wooden door shutting behind her with a definitive thud. The silence that followed her departure was heavy, but for the first time in 12 years, it did not feel oppressive. Heather looked down at her hands and offered a genuine apology for spreading rumors and enabling her mother's toxicity, admitting that she needed to take responsibility for her own life instead of leaning on family drama. Brian reached across the table and took my hand, holding it firmly in front of his family, giving me the visual proof of support that I had needed from him for over a decade. 2 days later, Brian and I sat side by side in a bright conference room at the title company, signing the endless stack of closing documents for our new home. The lender had finally cleared the file, and as the escrow officer slid the final pages across the desk, Brian turned to me and promised that he would never force me to bear his burdens or hide behind me again. I looked at the paperwork, signed my name in clear, bold strokes, and realized that while our marriage still required hard work and healing, the dynamic of fear had officially ended. When we took our daughter to the new house that afternoon, she immediately ran up the stairs to the smallest bedroom, pointing out the window at the large oak tree in the front yard and declaring it hers. We ate takeout pizza off the hardwood floor in the empty living room, surrounding ourselves with half-unpacked boxes and the quiet hum of a new beginning. Brian pulled out a set of new house keys, dropping the extra one into a kitchen drawer and confirming that no one would ever receive a key to our home without mutual respect and clear boundaries. Over the next few months, the ripple effects of that restaurant meeting continued to reshape the entire family structure. Evelyn refused to speak to us for several weeks, using relatives to pass along messages about how heartbroken she was. But Brian stood firm, refusing to engage with her guilt trips or make excuses for her behavior. Arthur continued attending individual counseling, slowly unlearning decades of conflict avoidance. While Heather began taking control of her own financial affairs, establishing a far healthier and more honest relationship with both of us. By the time February arrived, Evelyn finally reached out directly, asking to meet me at a local coffee shop without any audience or intermediaries. Sitting across from me in a quiet booth, she tried at first to offer excuses about stress and alcohol, but when I began to walk away, she stopped me and finally spoke the plain truth. She admitted to hitting me, acknowledged the horrible words she had directed at my daughter, and stated clearly that there was no excuse for what she had done, marking the very first time she had ever taken true accountability for her actions. I did not offer her immediate forgiveness or pretend that 12 years of mistreatment could be wiped away in a single afternoon. But I thanked her for finally stating the reality of what happened. We agreed on small, structured visits with our daughter at our home, keeping strict boundaries in place to ensure that any disrespect was met with an immediate end to the visit. Slowly, over the course of many months, she learned that her access to our family depended entirely on her ability to treat us with basic decency and respect. By the following winter, we decided to host a small, quiet holiday dinner at our new house, inviting Arthur, Evelyn, Heather, and a few close friends into our space. Halfway through the meal, my daughter accidentally knocked a glass of berry juice across the white tablecloth, causing the entire room to go dead silent as everyone braced for an outburst. Evelyn simply reached for a napkin, offered a soft smile, and remarked that accidents happen to everyone, prompting a collective sigh of relief and a warm laugh from around the table. Looking at my husband across the room, I knew that while the road to get here had been painful,